October 30th, 2002, the Ed Sullivan Theater in New York City. There was something different in the air that night. The stagehands felt it as they checked microphones and adjusted lights. The band members felt it during their pre-show warm-up. Even the audience, filing into their seats with the usual excitement of seeing a live taping, sensed that this Thursday evening would be unlike any other late show they'd attended. David Letterman stood backstage, holding his note cards but not reading them. He'd been doing this show for nearly 10 years, conducting thousands of interviews, cracking jokes with presidents and movie stars and musicians. But tonight, his hands were shaking slightly. Tonight wasn't about entertainment. Tonight was about saying goodbye to a friend. Warren Zevon was dying. Everyone knew it. The legendary singer-songwriter, the man who'd given the world Werewolves of London and Lawyers, Guns, and Money, the brilliant, troubled, impossibly talented artist who'd been David's friend for over 20 years, had been diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer 3 months earlier. Mesothelioma, the doctors called it. Aggressive, terminal, merciless. Warren had been given 3 months to live. Maybe 4, if he was lucky. He'd refused chemotherapy, refused to spend his final days sick from treatment. Instead, he'd decided to make one last album, say his goodbyes, and live whatever time remained on his own terms. And he'd asked David if he could come on the show one last time. David had said yes immediately, then spent the next 2 weeks trying not to think about what that conversation would actually be like. How do you interview a dying friend on national television? How do you balance respect with entertainment, honesty with discretion? How do you say goodbye to someone who's still sitting right in front of you? The stage manager's voice crackled through David's earpiece. 5 minutes to air, Dave. David nodded, straightening his tie, putting on the armor of his professional persona. But underneath, his heart was breaking. The show's opening went as planned. David delivered his monologue with the usual energy, jokes about politicians, and celebrities landing with the expected laughs. But the audience could sense something beneath the humor, a weight that David couldn't quite hide behind his trademark irony. Folks, we have a very special guest tonight, David said, his voice shifting to something more serious. A dear friend of mine, a musical genius, and one of the most honest songwriters who ever lived. Please welcome Warren Zevon. The audience applauded warmly as Warren walked onto the stage. He moved carefully, like a man conscious of his own fragility, but his smile was wide and genuine. He wore his usual outfit, black leather jacket, dark shirt, jeans, but the clothes hung looser than they used to. His face was thinner, his eyes deeper set. But when he shook David's hand and settled into the guest chair, his grip was still firm. Warren, thank you for being here. David's voice was steady, but those who knew him could hear the emotion underneath. Thank you for having me, Dave. Wouldn't miss it. The audience laughed softly at Warren's easy manner, but there was tension in the room. Everyone knew why Warren was here. This wasn't a promotional visit. This was a farewell. David looked down at his note cards, then set them aside. Whatever corporate had written for him didn't matter now. This conversation was going to be real. Warren, I think everyone here knows what we're dealing with. You were diagnosed with cancer a few months ago. How are you doing? Warren leaned back in his chair, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave to his lyrics. Well, Dave, I'm dying. That's the reality. The doctors gave me maybe 3 or 4 months. Could be less, could be a little more. But the clock is definitely ticking. The audience made a collective sound, not quite a gasp, but an intake of breath. Even though they'd known, hearing Warren say it so plainly, with such matter-of-fact acceptance, hit differently. And you decided not to do chemotherapy. I did. I watched what it did to people, the nausea, the exhaustion, the way it takes whatever time you have left and makes it miserable. I figured, I've got a limited number of days left. I want to be present for them. I want to feel them, even if some of them hurt. David nodded slowly. That takes courage. Warren shrugged. Or stubbornness. My ex-wives would probably vote for stubbornness. The audience laughed, grateful for the moment of levity. Warren grinned. I've spent my whole life being difficult. Seemed wrong to change now. So, what have you been doing? How are you spending your time? Making an album. My last one. It's called The Wind. Working with all my favorite musicians, guys I've known for decades. We're recording in my living room, basically. Very intimate. Very real. No studio tricks. No auto-tuning. Just me and a guitar and the truth. What's it like making an album when you know it's your last? Warren paused, and for the first time his composed expression flickered. It's liberating, actually. You stop worrying about what critics will think or whether it'll sell. You tell the truth. You say the things you never got around to saying. You make peace with your regrets. You say goodbye. David's throat tightened. He could feel tears threatening behind his glasses. That's beautiful, Warren. Or self-indulgent. Warren smiled sadly. But at this point, I think I've earned a little self-indulgence. The band's drummer, Anton Fig, who'd played on several of Warren's albums, was openly crying behind his drum kit. Paul Schaffer sat at his keyboard with his head down, shoulders shaking slightly. David took a breath, steadying himself. Warren, I want to ask you something. You've lived an incredible life. You've written songs that will outlive all of us. You've seen and done things most people only dream about. But now you're facing this. What have you learned? What wisdom can you share with us? It was the question David had been building toward all night, the question that mattered more than any joke or clever quip. In the face of death, what does life mean? Warren was quiet for a long moment. The studio was so silent you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Even the audience seemed to be holding their breath. When Warren finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. Enjoy every sandwich. The audience didn't react immediately. They were waiting for more, for elaboration, for some profound philosophical statement. But Warren just sat there, smiling slightly, letting the words stand on their own. David blinked. I'm sorry? Enjoy every sandwich, Warren repeated. That's it. That's what I've learned. Every sandwich, every cup of coffee, every conversation with a friend, every sunset, every stupid little moment that you usually rush through or take for granted. Stop and taste it. Feel it. Be present for it. Because you don't know when it'll be your last sandwich. David sat back in his chair, absorbing this, the simplicity of it, the profound ordinariness of it. Every sandwich, David said quietly. Every sandwich, Warren confirmed. I wasted so much time, Dave, decades, chasing something, running from something, too drunk or too high or too ambitious to just stop and taste the damn sandwich. Now that I can't run anymore, now that I've got maybe 90 days left if I'm lucky, I finally get it. The meaning isn't in the big moments, it's in the small ones, the ones we ignore because we're too busy planning for tomorrow. A woman in the front row was crying openly now. Others were wiping their eyes. David's own vision was blurring, but he refused to let the tears fall. Not yet. Warren, that's maybe the most profound thing anyone's ever said on this show. Warren shook his head. It's not profound. It's obvious. That's what kills me. It took dying to figure out something that should have been obvious from the beginning. David leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, completely abandoning any pretense of conducting a normal interview. Do you have regrets? Oh, thousands. Warren laughed darkly. I was a terrible husband, a worse father for a long time, though I got better toward the end. I drank too much, burned too many bridges, said cruel things to people who loved me. But you know what? The regrets aren't about the big dramatic mistakes. They're about the little moments I missed, the school plays I skipped, the dinners I rushed through, the conversations I half listened to because I was thinking about something else, all those sandwiches I didn't taste. He paused, his eyes distant. My son called me last week, just to talk, and I realized, for maybe the first time in his life, I wasn't thinking about anything else. I wasn't planning my next song or worrying about money or wishing I was somewhere else. I was just there, listening to him tell me about his day, and it was perfect. That's what I want people to understand. You don't need to be dying to feel that. You can choose to be present right now. The audience sat in absolute stillness. This wasn't what they'd signed up for when they requested late show tickets. They'd come for laughs, for celebrity gossip, for a fun night out. Instead, they were getting a masterclass in mortality from a dying man who'd finally figured out how to live. David took off his glasses, wiping his eyes openly now. Warren, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll remember. When you're eating lunch tomorrow, or having coffee, or talking to someone you love, be there. Really be there. Taste it. David nodded, unable to speak. The interview continued for another 15 minutes. They talked about Warren's final album, about the musicians who'd played on it, about the legacy he hoped to leave, but the energy had shifted. The conversation was no longer between a talk show host and his guest. It was between two middle-aged men, both acutely aware that time was finite, both grappling with what that meant. When they finally went to commercial, David did something he rarely did. He stood up, walked around his desk, and hugged Warren. Not the quick, performative hug of television, but a real embrace between friends who knew this might be their last time together. "I love you, Warren," David whispered, too quiet for the microphones to catch. "I know, Dave. I love you too." When the show ended and the audience filed out, still wiping their eyes, David and Warren sat together backstage in David's dressing room. They didn't talk much. Warren was tired and David was emotionally exhausted, but they sat in comfortable silence, two old friends who didn't need words anymore. As Warren prepared to leave, he pulled a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He'd written something on it in his distinctive scrawl. "Dave, I want you to have this. Don't read it now. Read it later when you need it." David took the note, folding it carefully and slipping it into his own pocket. "Thank you for tonight, Warren. Thank you for being honest." Warren smiled, that crooked, knowing smile that had charmed and confounded people for decades. "Thanks for giving me a place to say goodbye. And Dave, remember the sandwich?" "I will." Warren Zevon died on September 7th, 2003, 10 months after his final appearance on The Late Show. He lived longer than the doctors predicted, long enough to finish his album, long enough to say his goodbyes, long enough to reconcile with his children. His final album, The Wind, was released 2 weeks before his death. It won multiple Grammy Awards. Critics called it a masterpiece, but more than that, it was honest, raw, vulnerable, brave. It was Warren finally saying all the things he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. David Letterman didn't attend the funeral. He couldn't. Instead, he spent that day alone, thinking about their last conversation, about sandwiches and regret and the cruel brevity of life. That night, before he went on air, David remembered the note Warren had given him. He'd kept it in his desk drawer for almost a year, unable to bring himself to read it. But now, with Warren gone, it felt like time. He unfolded the paper with shaking hands. Warren's handwriting was barely legible as always, but the message was clear. "Dave, thanks for letting me be human on your show. Not funny or clever or promotional, just human. You gave me that gift. Here's the truth. I'm not scared of dying. I'm scared of all the living I didn't do when I had the chance. Don't make my mistake. Taste the sandwich. Every single one. Love, Warren." David sat at his desk in his empty dressing room and wept. The next day, he called a production meeting. His entire staff gathered, expecting notes on booking or ratings or the usual television business. Instead, David told them about Warren Zevon. "I want you all to understand something," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "Warren taught me something before he died. He said, 'Enjoy every sandwich.' And I think he's right. We spend so much time rushing, planning, worrying about the next show, the next guest, the next ratings period. But what are we missing while we're doing that? What sandwiches are we not tasting?" He looked around the room at faces he'd worked with for years, producers, writers, camera operators, sound techs. "From now on, before every show, I want us to remember Warren's lesson. We're going to take a moment, just a moment, to be present, to appreciate that we're here doing this work together, to taste the sandwich." And he did. For the rest of his time hosting The Late Show, David Letterman began every taping with a simple ritual. He'd gather the crew and someone would say, "Let's enjoy the sandwich." It became their code, their reminder, their way of honoring Warren Zevon's final lesson. The audience never knew about this ritual. It wasn't for them. It was for the people who made the show, the people who spent their lives in service of entertainment, but sometimes forgot to be present for their own lives. Years later, when David Letterman retired from The Late Show in 2015, he gave his final monologue. He thanked his staff, his band, his writers, his family. And at the very end, he said something that made no sense to most viewers, but meant everything to the people who'd worked with him. "Before I go, I want to thank someone who's not here anymore. A friend who taught me something important. He told me to enjoy every sandwich. I've tried, my friend. I've tried. In the audience that night, several of Warren Zevon's family members were crying. They understood. David had kept his promise. The note Warren had written remained in David's desk drawer until the day he left the Ed Sullivan Theater for the last time. He took it with him, along with a few other precious mementos, photos of his children, letters from friends, small objects that held outsized meaning. At home, David framed the note and hung it in his office. Visitors would sometimes ask about it, curious about the cryptic message. David would smile and say, "Just a reminder from a friend, about sandwiches." Most people assumed it was an inside joke. They didn't understand that it was actually a philosophy, a way of living, a final gift from a dying man to those still lucky enough to have time. Warren Zevon's appearance on The Late Show that October night in 2002 became legendary. The clip has been viewed millions of times online. "Enjoy every sandwich" became a catchphrase, printed on t-shirts and coffee mugs, quoted in graduation speeches and eulogies. But the real impact wasn't in the viral fame. It was in the quiet moments. The person who put down their phone during dinner to really listen to their partner. The parent who stopped rushing their child through bedtime to savor the story one more time. The worker who paused to actually taste their lunch instead of eating mechanically at their desk. Every person who heard Warren's words and chose to be present, to taste the sandwich, to stop running long enough to feel their own life. They were his legacy. David Letterman never forgot that night. In interviews years later, he would often cite it as the most meaningful moment of his career. Not the funniest, not the most watched, but the most true. Warren was dying, David said in one interview, but that night he was more alive than most people ever are. He'd stopped pretending. He'd stopped performing. He was just honest about what matters. And what matters is showing up, being present, tasting the sandwich. The interviewer had asked David what he thought Warren would say if he could see how his message had spread, how many people it had touched. David smiled, his eyes distant. "I think Warren would laugh at all of us for needing a dying man to tell us something so obvious. But then he'd probably pour a drink, assuming there are drinks in heaven, and toast to all the sandwiches we're finally tasting." On what would have been Warren Zevon's 75th birthday, David Letterman posted something on social media, a rarity for him. It was a simple photo, a sandwich, nothing fancy, just turkey and lettuce on wheat bread, sitting on a paper plate. The caption read, "For Warren, still tasting them, still grateful." The post went viral. Thousands of people shared photos of their own sandwiches, their own ordinary moments made extraordinary by the simple act of attention. #enjoy. Every sandwich trended worldwide. People told stories of how Warren's words had changed them, reminded them, saved them. But the most moving responses came from those who'd lost someone. They wrote about how Warren's message helped them grieve, helped them understand that honoring the dead meant living more fully, not less. That the way to remember someone wasn't to stop tasting sandwiches, but to taste them more deeply, with more gratitude, with more presence. "My father died last year," one person wrote. "He loved sandwiches. It was his thing. Every Saturday morning, he'd make elaborate sandwiches with ingredients he'd collect all week. I used to think it was weird, how seriously he took something so simple. But now I understand. He was enjoying every sandwich. He knew something the rest of us are still learning." Warren Zevon had been dead for over 20 years, but his final lesson continued to resonate. Because it wasn't really about sandwiches. It was about attention, presence, gratitude. It was about the radical act of being fully alive before you die. David Letterman is retired now, living quietly, spending time with family, enjoying the ordinary pleasures he once rushed past. He gardens, he reads, he talks to old friends without checking his watch. He eats slowly, and sometimes, sitting on his porch with a sandwich at lunch, he thinks about Warren. He thinks about that October night when a dying man taught a room full of strangers the most important lesson they'd ever learn. He thinks about how strange it is that we need to be reminded to taste our food, feel our feelings, be present for our own lives, how death has to tap us on the shoulder before we remember to live. But mostly, David feels grateful. Grateful for Warren's honesty, grateful for the years they had, grateful for one more day, one more sandwich, one more chance to get it right. The Late Show studio is dark now, converted to other uses. The desk where David and Warren had that conversation has been replaced. The lights that illuminated their final goodbye have been struck. The moment itself exists only in recordings and memories, but the message remains. It lives in every person who pauses before eating, who closes their eyes and tastes what's in front of them, who chooses presence over distraction, who honors a dying man's wisdom by learning the lesson before it's too late. Enjoy every sandwich. It's not profound, it's not complicated, it's not revolutionary, it's just true. And sometimes, on Thursday nights, when the world feels too rushed and too loud and too much, people remember. They remember a rock star in a leather jacket, sitting in a guest chair, calmly discussing his own death and offering the simplest, most perfect advice. They remember David Letterman setting down his note cards and really listening. They remember a moment when entertainment stopped and humanity began. They remember that life is short and sandwiches are ordinary, and that's exactly the point. So they eat slowly. They taste fully. They live presently. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Warren Zevon smiles. Because his final song, his last great composition, wasn't on an album or a stage. It was a simple sentence that changed how people live. Enjoy every sandwich, every single one.